We often think of evil as a loud, monstrous force, a sudden, violent storm that appears without warning. But true horror, the kind that lingers in the soul, is often quieter. It grows in the dark, nourished by the venom of quiet contempt, watered by the tears of humiliation. It's the pressure cooker of the human heart, slowly building toward an explosion that no one, least of all the one who holds it, sees coming. The story you are about to witness is not just a tale of murder. It's the anatomy of a soul's collapse, a love story that ends in a massacre. Before we pull back the curtain on this tragedy, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and enable notifications. Your viewership allows us to continue exploring these complex, human stories. We appreciate you being here. Now, let the story begin. Julian Croft existed in a world of controlled miniatures. His life was a collection of small, achievable perfections. It was in the precise 19 grams of finely ground coffee for a double shot of espresso, the 9 bars of pressure from the machine, the 28-second extraction time that produced a flawless, hazelnut-colored crema. It was in the glossy, microfoamed milk he would pour into the shape of a rosetta or a swan, a transient piece of art that would be destroyed by a spoon moments later. This was his domain, the daily grind, a cozy, independent cafe where the aroma of roasted beans was a constant, comforting incense. Julian, at 24, was a quiet maestro of this small symphony. He was observant, intense, and possessed a gentleness in his hands that belied the frustrated ambition simmering beneath his calm exterior. His apartment, a cramped space above a perpetually humming laundromat, was his true inner sanctum. Bookshelves overflowed with poetry and classic novels, the spines worn from countless readings. Sketchbooks were filled with haunting charcoal drawings of lonely city benches and rain-slicked alleyways. Notebooks contained the beginnings of 100 short stories, character sketches, and poignant observations, a universe of creativity locked away by a crippling fear of failure. He was an artist in hiding, and his barista apron was his invisibility cloak. He was respected for his craft within the cafe's walls, but once he stepped outside, he felt he became just another part of the city's anonymous background hum. This carefully controlled, muted existence was shattered the day Clara Thornton walked in. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a typically slow period. She didn't just order, she engaged. While others looked past him at the menu board, she looked at him. She had hair the color of warm honey and eyes that held a genuine, startling curiosity. She noticed the way he carefully wiped the steam wand, the focused intensity in his expression as he prepared her friend's cappuccino. "That's beautiful," she said, her voice clear and bright, pointing to the delicate fern pattern he'd poured. "You're an artist." No one had ever called him that before, at least not with such unadorned sincerity. For Julian, who secretly yearned for that title more than any other, the word landed like a revelation. From that day on, her visits became the anchor points of his week. They started with small talk about coffee, which blossomed into conversations about the books she saw him reading behind the counter, then to art, film, and the secret, beautiful corners of the city they both loved. He learned she was a graduate student in art history, a discipline that felt both impossibly sophisticated and intimately familiar to him. She was confident, educated, and moved with an effortless grace that spoke of a life free from the anxieties that plagued him. Yet it was his world that fascinated her. She loved the cafe, the smell, the sounds. She loved his small apartment, calling it a treasure box of stories and ideas. She would sit for hours, watching him sketch, reading his half-finished stories and offering insights that were both brilliant and encouraging. With Clara, Julian felt as if a light had been switched on inside him, illuminating rooms he didn't even know were there. He was no longer just the quiet barista. He was Julian, a man of depth and talent. Her love became his armor, his validation, the single most beautiful thing in his carefully curated world. He had never felt so seen, so hopeful. Which is why, when he was finally exposed to the full glare of her family's world, the shadows it cast were so dark and so absolute. The first meeting was staged at the Thornton residence, a term that felt more appropriate than house. It was a minimalist fortress of glass, steel, and white stone in a neighborhood where the silence was a commodity. The moment his scuffed but clean leather boots touched the impossibly thick, cream-colored carpet, Julian felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he had accidentally wandered onto a museum exhibit. Richard Thornton, the patriarch, was a celebrated cardiac surgeon. He carried himself with the unshakable authority of a man who routinely held a human heart in his hands. His handshake was firm, dry, and brief a clinical evaluation. His pale blue eyes performed a swift, dismissive scan of Julian, from his simple dark jeans to his carefully ironed button-down shirt. Julian had the distinct impression he was being assessed for structural flaws. Eleanor, the mother, was a masterpiece of preserved elegance and weaponized politeness. Her smile was a dazzling, practiced thing that never quite reached her eyes. She greeted him with a voice like chilled champagne. "Julian," she said, her tone dripping with a condescending sweetness. "Clara has told us so much about you. We're so thrilled to finally meet her. Barista, it must be such a creative outlet for you." Every word was a perfectly manicured dart. And then there was Marcus, Clara's older brother, an investment banker who seemed to be carved from the very essence of aggressive ambition. He had the sharp suit, the expensive watch, and the easy, predatory smirk of a man who had never lost at anything. He sized Julian up with a look of bemused pity. "So, Julian," he said, swirling a 2-inch pool of amber liquid in a heavy crystal tumbler. "You're the coffee guy. Clara says you're an artist. You draw those little pictures in the foam, right? That's cute. Real cute." The evening that followed was a slow, agonizing vivisection of Julian's entire sense of self. Dinner was served at a dining table so long and polished it felt like they were communicating across a continent. The conversation was a carefully curated minefield of topics designed to highlight Julian's otherness. Polo matches, the declining quality of service at a resort in St. Bart's, the intricacies of a recent corporate merger. Julian sat in silence, a castaway on their island of opulent boredom. When they finally turned their attention to him, their questions were interrogations disguised as pleasantries. "So, what's the long-term vision, Julian?" Richard asked, leaning forward and fixing him with his intense, surgical gaze. "Surely a young man with your potential isn't planning to serve coffee indefinitely. That's more of a student job, isn't it?" "I'm a writer," Julian heard himself say, the declaration sounding absurdly pretentious in this sterile environment. "I'm focusing on my writing." Eleanor let out a delicate, tinkling laugh that set Julian's teeth on edge. "Oh, a writer. How wonderfully bohemian. But one must be practical, mustn't one? So terribly difficult to make a living with words. I suppose it's a comfort to have a trade to fall back on." The word trade was delivered as if she were describing plumbing. They dissected his background with the detached curiosity of anthropologists studying a primitive tribe. His mother, the receptionist. His deceased father, the mechanic. He saw the quick, knowing glances exchanged between them, the silent verdict. He was not one of them. He was a curiosity, Clara's brief flirtation with the common folk. Clara, bless her heart, tried to run interference. She would squeeze his hand under the table, a secret signal of solidarity. She would desperately try to pivot the conversation. "Julian is the most well-read person I know, Dad. You should see his library." Richard would respond with a noncommittal grunt, his dismissal more potent than any overt insult. Her defenses only seemed to underscore his need to be defended, making the situation even more humiliating. The true nadir of the evening arrived with the cognac. Marcus, flush with self-satisfaction after recounting a story about a particularly ruthless business deal, leaned back in his chair, fixing Julian with a magnanimous, pitying smile. "You know, Jules, I almost envy you," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole table to hear. "No real stress, no markets to watch, no clients to manage. Just wake up, froth a little milk, make people smile. Must be a nice, simple life." It was the final, most piercing cut. It was a complete negation of his entire being, his intellect, his ambition, his inner turmoil, his art. He was reduced to a simple, mindless function. In that instant, a feeling unlike any he had ever known, a white-hot, silent rages urged through him. It was so pure and so intense it made the room swim. He looked at Marcus's smug, handsome face and felt a primal, horrifying urge to shatter that heavy crystal glass against his perfect teeth. The car ride back to Clara's apartment was a study in contrasts. She was chattering nervously, trying to paint the evening in a better light, completely oblivious to the silent, seismic event that had just occurred within him. "Don't mind them," she said with a forced laugh. "They're just a lot. They're like that with everyone. Once they get to know you, they'll love you." Julian barely registered her words. He was trapped in an echo chamber of the evening's insults. They hadn't just been rude. They had systematically stripped him of his dignity. They had held his life up to the light, examined it, and declared it worthless. The beautiful, protective armor of Clara's love had been shattered, and he was left standing naked and exposed in the cold, harsh glare of their judgment. When he dropped her off, he couldn't kiss her. He felt contaminated, unworthy. He drove back to his apartment, the one she had called a treasure box, and it now felt like a cage. He sat in the dark, the familiar hum of the laundromat below a mocking reminder of his station. The Thorntons had planted a seed in him that night. A cold, hard, cancerous seed of pure, unadulterated hatred. And in the fertile soil of his profound humiliation, it had already begun to take root. The aftermath of the dinner was a period of quiet denial. Julian and Clara retreated into the sanctuary of their own world, the bubble they had created in cozy cafes and his book-lined apartment. They didn't speak of her family. It became an unspoken taboo, a locked room in the house of their relationship. But while the door was closed, the thing inside was growing. The seed of Julian's rage, watered by his shame, was germinating in the dark. His perception of the world began to warp. Every stray comment and observation now filtered through the lens of that humiliating evening. If Clara mentioned a friend who had just passed the bar exam, he wouldn't hear about her friend's success. He would hear Richard Thornton's voice in his head. Something more substantial? When she excitedly talked about an upcoming art gala her mother was helping to organize, he would envision Eleanor moving through the crowd, whispering to her friends about Clara's quaint little boyfriend who worked for tips. He started to see the Thorntons not as three individuals, but as a monolithic entity, them, a force of judgment that was constantly, silently, pulling Clara away from him. The pressure began to manifest in his art. His writing became stalled, paralyzed. He would sit for hours staring at a blank page, the cursor blinking mockingly. Every sentence he managed to construct felt clumsy and amateurish. He would read it back and hear Marcus's sneering voice. "A writer! How quaint!" The creative wellspring that Clara's love had uncorked had been poisoned. His art was no longer a refuge. It was a mirror reflecting his own perceived inadequacies. His resentment became an obsession, a secret, consuming hobby. He would spend hours online, not on writing forums or news sites, but on the social media pages of the Thornton family. It was a form of self-flagellation. He'd look at photos of Richard on his sailboat, his face tan and relaxed, the picture of effortless superiority. He'd study images of Eleanor at charity luncheons, her smile a perfect, impenetrable fortress. He'd fixate on pictures of Marcus, always surrounded by a pack of equally smug, handsome men, raising glasses of champagne on a rooftop bar or a ski slope. He wasn't just looking at pictures. He was gathering evidence. Each photo was another exhibit in the case he was building in his mind, proof that they were not just people, but symbols of a corrupt, arrogant world that had deemed him unworthy. He was dehumanizing them, transforming them from Clara's family into archetypal villains in the tragic narrative of his own life. Several months later, the second trial by fire occurred. It was the Thorntons' anniversary, and they were hosting a large garden party. Clara had pleaded with him to come. "It'll be different," she'd insisted, her eyes full of a hope that he no longer shared. "There will be lots of people. We can just blend in. Please, Jules. It would mean the world to me if you would just try." His agreeing to go was a fatal miscalculation. Blending in was impossible. He was a black and white figure in their technicolor world, dressed in his best and only suit, which suddenly felt cheap and ill-fitting. He was adrift in a sea of pastel linen and quiet old money. No one spoke to him. He stood awkwardly by the bar, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching Clara get absorbed into conversations from which he was tacitly excluded. He saw Richard holding court with a group of other doctors, their laughter booming across the manicured lawn. He watched Eleanor glide from group to group, a perfect hostess who managed to make eye contact with everyone in the garden except for him. At one point, he tried to join Clara's conversation with Marcus and some of his friends. Marcus saw him approach, paused mid-sentence, and then, with a barely concealed smirk, turned his back slightly, effectively shutting him out of the circle. It was a small, brutal act of social violence, and it was devastatingly effective. Julian retreated to the edge of the patio, his face burning. He was invisible. He was nothing. From his vantage point, he watched Clara. He saw her laugh at a joke one of Marcus's friends told. He saw her accept a glass of champagne from her father. And in his paranoid, resentful state, he didn't see a daughter interacting with her family. He saw a defector. He saw her choosing them, their world, their values over him. The chasm between them seemed to widen into an uncrossable canyon. The breaking point, the moment the final crack spiderwebbed across the canvas of his sanity, was the fight in the car on the way home. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. "You were quiet tonight," Clara said finally, her voice tentative. "I didn't have much to say," Julian replied, his voice flat and cold. "I don't know much about summering in the Hamptons." "Julian, please don't start." "Start what?" he snapped, the control he'd been maintaining all evening finally shattering. "Start telling the truth? Your family despises me, Clara. They don't even see me as a human being. Your brother physically turned his back on me. Did you see that? Or were you too busy laughing with his clone army?" "That's not fair," she shot back, her voice rising. "They were his friends from business school. I was being polite. What did you want me to do? Ignore everyone and stand in a corner with you all night?" "I wanted you to stand with me," he roared, the words tearing from his throat. "I wanted you to show them, just for a second, that I'm not some stray dog you brought in off the street. That I matter. But you can't, can you? Because you're one of them. That's a horrible thing to say," she cried, tears welling in her eyes. "I love you. Isn't that enough?" "It used to be," he said, and the coldness in his own voice shocked him. He pulled the car to the curb, the engine idling. "But it's not enough to stand up to them, is it? It's not enough to make you choose. And you know what the worst part is, Clara? I think deep down a part of you is embarrassed by me. A part of you agrees with them." He saw the look on her face. It was not anger. It was a deep, profound wound. He had taken all the poison they had fed him and had spat it directly at her. He had weaponized his pain and aimed it at the only person who had ever truly loved him. She didn't say another word. She got out of the car and walked into her apartment without looking back. The week that followed was a descent into a silent, cold hell. She didn't call. He didn't call. The silence was his proof. He had given her a choice, and she had chosen them by not choosing him. In the lonely, echoing void of that week, his obsessive resentment underwent a final, terrifying alchemy. It was no longer a passive, burning anger. It became an active, problem-solving logic. His writer's mind, so used to structuring narratives, began to structure a new one. In this story, the Thorntons were not just antagonists. They were a disease, a malignant cancer infecting Clara, poisoning their love. A cancer, he reasoned with a chilling, detached clarity, is not something you live with. It is something you cut out. The idea, once unthinkable, now presented itself as the only possible solution. It was a grand, romantic, and horrific gesture. He wouldn't be committing murder. He would be performing a surgery. He would be liberating Clara from the toxic influence that was suffocating her spirit and destroying their future. He would be a savior, performing a terrible but necessary act of purification. This grotesque rationalization took hold of him completely. He began to plan with the meticulous detail of an artist preparing his masterpiece. He knew their habits, their routines. He knew the layout of their fortress. He knew its weaknesses. One night, while closing the cafe, he was disassembling the group head of the espresso machine for its nightly cleaning. He held the portafilter in his hand, the heavy, chrome-plated brass handle with the steel filter basket. It was solid, dense, perfectly weighted. It was a tool of his trade, a symbol of the world they despised. Felt right. It felt poetic. He looked at his reflection in the polished surface of the machine. The face staring back was calm, its eyes clear and focused. It was the face of a man who had finally figured out his ending. The hero, he told himself, had to make a sacrifice to save the princess. He had to slay the dragons. The storm that rolled in on Saturday night was biblical. Rain lashed against the windows of the cafe in horizontal sheets, and the wind howled with a mournful, feral rage. It was the perfect pathetic fallacy, a sky mirroring the tempest in Julian's soul. The week of silence from Clara had been the final incubation period. His grief and longing had hardened into a diamond-sharp resolve. She had not called. The Thorntons had won. In his mind, the narrative was now set in stone. He was not an aggressor. He was a rescuer, embarking on a desperate, righteous mission. After locking up the cafe, he didn't go home. He went to his car and sat for a long time, listening to the storm. He was unnaturally calm, the chaotic energy of the past few months having coalesced into a single, still point of purpose. He took the heavy, steel portafilter from his bag and placed it in the large inner pocket of his dark jacket. He pulled on a pair of thin, black leather gloves. Each movement was fluid, deliberate, ritualistic. The insecure boy who had nervously straightened his shirt before meeting her parents was gone. In his place was an instrument of what he saw as inevitable tragic justice. He parked his car on a leafy side street, a quarter of a mile from the Thornton residence. The walk was like moving through a dream. The wind tore at his jacket, and the rain plastered his hair to his forehead, but he barely felt it. The opulent houses of the neighborhood were dark and silent, their inhabitants sealed away from the storm. He felt a profound sense of separation, as if he were a visitor from another reality, come to correct a flaw in theirs. The Thornton house was not entirely dark. A few soft lights glowed from within, beacons in the churning darkness. He didn't even consider the front door. He slipped through the side gate, moving like a phantom through the meticulously landscaped garden. The wind thrashed the expensive Japanese maples, their leaves whispering frantically. He felt no fear, only a cold, electric sense of destiny. He found the side door to the kitchen exactly as he had fantasized. Ajar. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it filled him with a final surge of righteous fury. They lived in a glass fortress but believed themselves so untouchable they didn't need to lock their doors. He slipped inside, the sound of his entry swallowed by a sudden, deafening clap of thunder. The house was quiet, save for the storm outside and the distant, tinny sound of a television. He stood for a moment in the vast, sterile kitchen, allowing his eyes to adjust. He was an infection entering a pristine body. He pulled the portafilter from his pocket. The cool, solid weight of it in his gloved hand was the only real thing in the world. He followed the sound of the TV. Eleanor was in the den, curled under a cashmere throw on a white sofa, watching an old film. But Julian's focus was the study across the hall. A thin sliver of light shone from beneath the door. He approached it, his footsteps silent on the thick rug. He turned the knob slowly. It was unlocked. Richard Thornton sat at his massive desk, bathed in the warm glow of a green banker's lamp. He was reading, a pair of glasses perched on his nose. He looked, in that moment, merely like a man. But to Julian, he was the foundation of the rot, the architect of his humiliation. Julian stepped into the room. A floorboard, protesting under his weight, emitted a low groan. Richard looked up, his eyes adjusting from the page. Annoyance flickered across his features, followed by a wave of pure, uncomprehending shock. "Julian? What in God's name are you doing in my house?" Julian didn't speak. There were no words left. He had come to erase words, to erase judgment. He raised the steel instrument. He saw Richard's eyes widen, saw his mouth open to shout a name, Clara's, perhaps a final paternal command. The command never came. Julian moved with a swift, brutal grace, bringing the portafilter down in a devastating arc. The sound was not loud. It was a dense, percussive, final punctuation. The king had been toppled from his throne. A roaring filled Julian's ears, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt. He had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The act, so long rehearsed in his mind, was both horrifyingly real and strangely distant. He felt a dizzying surge of pure power. He turned and walked back into the hall. Eleanor had heard the sound. She was standing in the doorway of the den, her face a pale question mark. "Richard? Is someone there?" Then she saw Julian. She saw the dark spatter on his jacket, the terrible object in his hand. Her perfectly constructed face, a lifetime of poise and control, dissolved in an instant. Her mouth opened, and a thin, high-pitched scream of pure animal terror began to emerge. It was a sound of such absolute horror that Julian reacted instinctively, lunging forward to silence it. The queen fell on the pristine carpet of her court. Two down. Only the prince remained. Marcus, the catalyst, the jester whose laughter had haunted his dreams. Julian knew Marcus often used the state-of-the-art gym in the basement when he stayed over. He descended the stairs, his hand trailing on the cool, polished banister. The gym was a temple of vanity, all mirrors and chrome. And Marcus was there, music blasting in his noise-canceling headphones, midway through a set of bicep curls, his own reflection his only audience. He saw Julian in the mirror first. He dropped the dumbbells with a deafening clang, his expression shifting from confusion to aggressive indignation. He ripped the headphones from his ears. "What the hell are you doing down here, you psycho?" "I'm calling the cops." He started to move towards a phone on the wall. "She loved me," Julian said, his voice a low, chilling rasp. Marcus stopped. He saw the weapon. He saw the look in Julian's eyes. The arrogance on his face finally gave way to a primal fear. But unlike his parents, Marcus was a fighter. He was bigger, stronger. He charged not to escape but to attack. The fight was a chaotic, brutal explosion of violence. They crashed into a rack of weights, sending them scattering. They grappled on the rubberized floor, a desperate, grunting struggle. The mirrored walls reflected the carnage from a dozen angles, a horrifying kaleidoscope of their deadly dance. Marcus was strong, but his strength was for show. Julian's was forged in the crucible of pure, distilled hatred. His rage was a fuel that Marcus, with his life of ease, could not possibly match. The struggle ended as brutally as it had begun, in a final, terrible silence punctuated only by Julian's ragged breaths. He stood up, his body screaming with pain, his mind eerily quiet. He looked at his own reflection in the mirror. He was spattered with the blood of his dragons. He had won. He walked back upstairs, a conquering soldier in a fallen kingdom. He moved through the silent, opulent rooms, a ghost in the house he had haunted and had now claimed. The rage was gone. The hatred was gone. The power he had felt was draining away, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. He had done it. He had cleared the board. He had set Clara free. But as he looked at the scene in the den, at the overturned lamp and the spreading stain on the white rug, the horrific reality of his liberation began to dawn. He had not performed a clean surgery. He had committed a butchery. He walked to the ornate telephone on a side table. His gloved finger, steady as a surgeon's, dialed Clara's number. She answered on the third ring, her voice a fragile mix of anger and hope. "Julian." "It's done, Clara," he said, his voice a dead, flat monotone. "I fixed it. I fixed everything for us." What are you talking about?" "Julian, where are you? You sound strange." "I'm at your parents' house," he said. He looked around the silent, tomb-like room. You should come home. Everything is quiet now. We can finally be together. No one will ever hurt us again. He placed the receiver back in its cradle before she could respond. He walked over to the white sofa and sat down, a few feet from where Eleanor lay. He waited. The storm raged outside, but inside the house, a new, more terrible silence reigned. He looked at the portafilter, the tool of his humble trade, now an instrument of carnage. He had brought his world into theirs and had destroyed them both. He thought of Clara's face, her luminous smile, the genuine warmth in her eyes when she'd first called him an artist. He had committed this atrocity in the name of that love. But as he sat there, in the dead heart of the silence, he knew the truth. He had not saved their love. He had immolated it. He had taken the beautiful, delicate canvas of their life together and had not merely smudged it, but had violently, irredeemably painted it over in blood. The artist had finally created his masterwork, a portrait of absolute horror, and soon its only audience would arrive.